welcome to the BS and Beer Show. BS stands for Building Science. We've been doing this monthly. Tonight, we're going to talk about using the beam estimator. So super excited about this topic tonight. I'm Emily Mottram. I am here in Maine. I'm an architect. I am drinking lovely water, spring water tonight. Sorry to all my beer drinkers. Suggest what you're drinking in the chat. BS and Beer is an independent grassroots movement to share building science knowledge through our local meetup groups and this, our Zoom show. The Brew Crew and our guests volunteer our time each month to bring this to you, what we hope is fun and informative discussion. If you're interested in starting your own group, we encourage that. Find advice on how to start your own group on the bsandbeershow.com or ask one of us in the chat or after the show. We want to say thank you to our media partners, Green Building Advisor and Fine Home Building Magazine. So Ben, you're on announcements tonight.
All right, I'm Ben Bogey. I'm a project manager in Connecticut, and this evening I'm drinking a lovely sour Weiss style ale with cherries from Watson Farmhouse Brewery, about 6 miles from my house. It's delightful and refreshing, and we need it because it was 84 degrees here today. So find your chat box icon at the bottom of your screen, post questions and comments there. Be sure to click all panelists and attendees or everyone. Otherwise, Zoom tends to revert to panelists only, which means only we can see your comments, and we're usually not having the bandwidth to pay attention to them. So make sure you click the right selection. Fine Home Building sends out Zoom reminders each month. If you want to receive those as well as other information, join our mailing list at thebsandbeershow.com or check out the monthly BS and Beer post on Green Building Advisor. The video recordings of tonight's show will be available at Green Building Advisor, and all past shows can be found on YouTube and through a link at thebsandbeershow.com. An audio-only version of the BS and Beer Show is available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And now to you, Mike.
Thank you, Ben. I'm Mike Maines in Maine. Tonight I am drinking a LaCroix Pamplemousse with a little bit of gin. So grapefruit and gin. Not a good combination, but I'm going to suffer through. And yeah, so for special announcements, first, I see Hans Bro is on the show. I just wanted to thank Hans. He is helping us get set up as a 501c3 not-for-profit, so we can start receiving sponsor money to help fund scholarships. It's been a long process, and it's surprisingly tricky to get all the I's crossed and T's dotted or whatever. So thanks, Hans, for doing that, and everybody else. Where's my thing? I do want to announce that the Pretty Good House book is live and does exist. Some people are getting it. None of the authors have seen a copy yet, but hopefully we will soon. If you want a copy, you can order one from Taunton or Amazon or wherever books are sold. And as a teaser, next month's BS and Beer Show is going to be a launch party / roast. So we'll have our retired editor will be back, and he'll roast us more than anything, since we forced him into early retirement, and the publisher and everybody else involved. So tune in next month for a relatively fun, lighthearted show. And I do want to announce the newest BS and Beer group is in Sacramento. They don't have a dedicated Instagram page yet, but they will. So if you're in Sacramento and want to join a local BS and Beer community, you are in luck. And we'll put those posts in the chat. I will turn it over to Travis to introduce our distinguished guests.
Yes, I'm Travis Brungart. I'm in Prairie Village, Kansas, where I build high performance houses with my friend and business partner Joe, and occasionally with Ben Bogey when he comes to visit. I'm drinking water because I have the same dehydration headache that I've had for 2 days. It's well over the 84 that you're suffering with, Ben. We have the severe heat advisory going here. So we've been cooking. So if I can ever get rid of the headache, I'll start drinking beer again. Keep the faith. I'll get there. I have the privilege of introducing our esteemed guests. We have Chris Magwood, the executive director of the Endeavor Center, a nonprofit sustainable building school in Peterborough, Ontario. He helped establish the Builders for Climate Action and is the author of several books on sustainability, including the recently released Build Beyond Zero with co-author Bruce King. Lovely, nice visual aid, Mike. Really way to stick with it. Chris, it's our pleasure to have you back. Thanks for returning to the show. Tell us a little bit more, and certainly, what are you drinking?
Well, to start with, I am also drinking water, although I did go out to the garden and drop a couple fresh raspberries in it to make it a little more than just water. But
Well done.
yeah.
So in addition to the book, which is new, what else is going on? What do you got? Or actually tell us about the book.
Sure. Yeah. The book is it's exciting. It's all about kind of how buildings could go past just doing less harm to the climate and actually start doing some good. So talking about buildings as the planet's next big carbon sink, and so looking at that through a bunch of lenses, materials, codes, all kinds of stuff, and sort of how that move can also help in lots of other ways with building health and sort of like moving towards a greener, fairer, and more inclusive economy and stuff. It's kind of Bruce and I, our roadmap to the great future that we'd like to think is possible, and kind of trying to point as many people in that direction as we can.
That's a beautiful thing. Thanks for doing the good work. I also get to introduce Jacob, who you can't see, but I promise he is here. Jacob
I
Deva
swear I'm
Racusin.
here.
He's real. He does exist. It's like the Pretty Good House book. You just can't
Actually,
see
for
it.
people who don't know, we should just come clean. And
Well played.
Jacob is actually, I've been practicing ventriloquism for a long time, and so he's never existed. I just have been learning to not move my mouth, and so I have like this sidekick who I can like have the other conversation with.
I'm just a foil for Chris's better half. That's all that's happening here.
That's lovely. Well, Jacob, thank you for joining us again. Jacob Deva Racusin is studio director and director of building science and sustainability with New Frameworks Natural Design Build in Vermont, which offers services in renovation, new construction, consultation, and education. Jacob's a member of the Carbon Leadership Forum, engaged in code and policy development, professional training, and other initiatives. I am really always excited to talk to you, Jacob. So thank you for coming back. We can't see you, so you have to be very descriptive. What are you wearing? How do you smell? And of course, what are you drinking?
So my chiseled jawline and my piercing blue eyes with my full head of hair would be what and my flawless skin, of course, is what you would be enjoying were my camera functioning right now. Instead, just paint that picture in your minds. I'm still the same balding bearded guy you've probably seen in the past. Just use that picture. I'm drinking I brew my own cider, so I just cracked open for the occasion, a fresh bottle of I hop infused a couple of gallons on this one. I highly, everyone who's into the dry, crisp cider world, throw in some. I think I used mosaic hops, which gives it a little bit of a citrus vibe. Highly recommend for you cider brewers at home.
That sounds fantastic. I'm coming over to visit.
Anytime.
Well, with that, I do believe Chris was going to start us off with you're going to start with a little brief history of Beam and get us going. Is that accurate?
Yeah. And I kind of, I had a slide deck lined up, but part of me feels like this is a nice format to just talk. So maybe I'll just talk, and easier for, folks to kind of step in and ask questions as I go. But I kind of wanted to just set up Beam, which is this material carbon estimator tool that we've put out with Builders for Climate Action, which there was nothing in my history or past that would suggest that I would ever be involved in making a software tool. So it's the process of this coming out and me having anything to do with it is kind of it's been a bit of a long, strange trip, which started with in 2013, I was working on a book called Making Better Buildings. And the idea of that book was to look at all the material options that a residential builder had and kind of give them a rating according to a bunch of different criteria. And from the get-go, one of those criteria was the embodied energy involved in making that material. And so as I was finding resources to kind of verify the embodied energy of a lot of different materials, I came across the inventory of carbon and energy from the University of Bath in England, which had just come out around that time. And it was kind of the first time that people had collected all this embodied energy data in one place. And so I was kind of working through their database and putting their numbers next to the materials in the book. And I noticed, oh, they have this other column, embodied carbon. I'd never heard that term before. And I was like, that's interesting, And so I read about it, I thought about it. I was like, oh, that's maybe a better thing to be thinking about, because this is measuring not just the amount of energy that went into making a material, but the emissions that come from making that material. And by 2013, climate was pretty, moving up the list of my own personal concerns and for a lot of people. So I was like, I'm going to put these embodied carbon numbers in. That seems like a good thing to do. And as I did that, I started thinking, well, now that I have these numbers, I should look at one of our building projects here at the school and add up all of these numbers for a particular building. And as I did that, I started getting these total numbers for the building that were just making my jaw drop, on both sides. Like some materials were like, I was like, this can't be right. Like, this material can't be responsible for this many emissions. There's no way, because the numbers are too big. And then on the other side, there were these carbon storing materials that were storing, like the numbers just seemed really weird to me. I was like, I need to learn more about this. And so I actually went back to school. I went to Trent University and did a master's program that sort of allowed me to dive into it. And at the end of that, the answer really was, wow, some of these numbers are really big and some of them are really small. And this really is the case. And while I was doing that master's, I sort of came up with a couple model buildings. I wanted to apply all of these numbers to these model buildings. I built myself a little spreadsheet to be able to do that. And once those results started coming out and I started presenting them, people were like, well, what tool did you use? And it's like, well, I made this little spreadsheet. And the interest in those results led to both the Canadian federal government and a couple of cities here in Canada asking us to do some reports, look at buildings in their area and kind of use this tool to do it. And so my initial tool wasn't robust enough to be running hundreds of buildings through. So kind of simultaneous to doing these studies, we ended up assembling this really killer crew of people who helped assemble the tool. Jacob, who's here, Eric Bowden was really key to that. Jen here at Builders for Climate Action, Melanie Trottier. So, we ended up kind of making this tool to do these studies, and then it seemed like, well, it would be really great to have, there he is, to have the tool be something that other people could use and access. And so, we worked on the interface a bit, and in May of this year decided to put it out. So it kind of comes from a place where it was built by a builder who wanted a tool that was really useful and worked for me as a builder. And so I think that's kind of, by the time it popped out the other side as something publicly available, it is that. It's really, I think, pretty easy to use and pretty intuitive and really informative for people in particular this kind of sector of the construction industry, because a lot of the other tools are really designed for and meant for really tall buildings and meant for the kind of sustainability experts who those big firms hire to do that kind of work. And so this tool really, it has the materials and the assemblies and kind of the interface that I think suits this kind of low-rise residential sector that we're in.
I'm thankful for that, because after I started discovering the work that you and Jacob were doing, being Nessie, and kind of got my head around this embodied carbon question, I started digging into some of those tools that were available and looking at EC3, and they were just they're too much for somebody in the residential world or in my section of the residential world to be able to conquer. The learning curve was immense to try and figure out how to use those tools and apply them to the work we're doing. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think one of the things too that for me doing the research, but then these studies and stuff, is what I really wanted was something that made the comparisons between sets of materials really obvious. And in lots of the other tools, I found like I could find the material and I could see like a value for that material, but then the only way to see the value for other materials was to sort of like go to the next one, and like nobody just gave me a list like, here's all the roofing materials that I could use, here's their carbon footprint for the same area, the same sort of functional value. And so what I really wanted from Beam was that like I can look at this and there they all are, and I can see what the numbers are, and I can start making choices because I can see all the relevant data for the building that I happen to be working on. And that worked well for me and what I wanted to do, but I think it's turned out to work well for other people as well.
We had a question. Is this tool just for new construction or renovation or deep energy retrofits? Can you guys explain a little bit about how the tool is formatted and how you go about putting together a model and what,
Sure.
what it spits out on the other end?
Yeah, and if it's helpful, I could sort of show some visuals of the tool and,
Sure.
and how it works. So let's see. I am able to screen share, correct? All right, let's see.
Well, now that we have Jacob, he should just pantomime.
That's right, yeah.
How do you pantomime a spreadsheet?
Only you can
You
share
read
that.
my mind.
We're gonna find out.
Yeah. So yeah, it is spreadsheet based. It lives in Google Sheets, and so that's the kind of overall methodology is pretty straightforward. There's a bunch of project information that you can put in here on this this project sheet. A bunch of stuff just for you to be able to track the details of your project, and then the guts of it are sort of here. You input all of your kind of main building dimensions. So we wanted to really make as few entries as possible for people using it. So these are, kind of like key overall dimensions, wall areas, floor areas, window areas, that kind of stuff, roof area. So you kind of feed that quantity information in. For those of you who are panicking because you see meters squared here, we did build in a toggle so it can be in imperial or metric. So that was we heard from a lot of people that would be a very valuable thing. So I'm working in meters now, but you can switch back and forth.
When I did my first model, I hadn't found the toggle yet, so there was probably about 50% of my time spent scratching my head about conversions.
Yeah, so the way the tool is structured is you give us some dimensions here. We use those dimensions to do some material takeoffs in the background, and then we have a database of environmental product declarations that give an emissions factor for in whatever quantity of material that document has, and we kind of take that environmental product declaration information about emissions and multiply it by the value that you're giving us, and you get a volume or an answer. So there's kind of a sheet for each assembly in the building. So across the bottom, there's footings and slabs, foundation walls, structure, exterior walls, etc. So we're on the exterior walls page, and you kind of all the options that you might use to build up an assembly for exterior walls are here. You kind of have to scroll, but if you are using light steel frame walls, you would tell us that it's 16 inches on center. And now you see that 10 square meters of wall of these different types of steel studs give you emissions of, this much. And so you can kind of scroll all your materials, structural sheathing, cavity insulation. For insulation, you kind of enter, an R value, and that, that influences the result. So you're kind of getting comparisons for, both the area and at a particular R value. And as you select a material, then the emissions for that material kind of go to, the subtotal for that assembly, but also to the total for your whole building. So the tool works in a few different ways. I know a lot of people use it just as a material comparison thing. So you set a value like I did, an even value, say 10 square meters, and you can just compare insulation, compare framing, compare sheathing, compare roofing, compare flooring, because you get all of that kind of side by side. And then people will use it to compare out entire assemblies. So we could go through this exterior walls and make one kind of wall assembly and then revisit it and make another kind of wall assembly and look at those comparatively. Like if you're interested in, frame walls with different insulations versus, say, I'm going to scroll down to say a foam ICF wall. So you could build it one way, then you could come back, you could build it another way with ICFs, you could build it another way with wood chip ICFs. So there's, a bunch of things. There's sit panels. So, you can sort of figure out, well, how do different approaches look? And then you can also go through all the tabs on the tool and build out a whole building model so that you're able to kind of see what an entire building looks like. And again, you could model it with some changes and get to see some of the comparisons between what impact certain material choices would have on your building.
Yeah, once you
So
sort
I
of
don't know
have
if
that,
that's,
yeah, once you sort of have that project page filled out where you put in kind of the areas and the masses of your building, it really is, for me, I found it's as simple as going back in and selecting or deselecting these different material options, and you can start to draw lines in the sand to compare different assemblies to one another. So one of the biggest things that I was looking forward to this tool for was in pre-construction, for me to make informed decisions about what are my choices and how much good am I actually doing, or am I doing any good with these choices? So you can, very rapidly, one of the questions is how long does it take to build an average model? I taught myself how to use Beam and modeled a 6,000 square foot house while on a 4-hour plane ride.
That's pretty good. Yeah, we generally tell people your first model will probably be about 4 hours if it's like a house, depends on how complicated it is. But yeah, definitely the part that takes the most time is inputting those dimensions. And there's more to the tool. There's this percentage function here. So, you can say I'm using 2 different types of cladding or flooring, or 3 different types. You can start to use the percentage function to say, well, 23% of the floor is tile, but the rest is hardwood, or, things like that. And so there's quite a bit of flexibility in the tool. Down at the bottom of every page, there's a way to access the entire database in this additional materials section, where, the other day I came across a house I was modeling that used metal ceiling panels, like pressed metal panels. Metal wasn't one of our ceiling options, but down here in additional materials, I can access, metal panels that we used for, say, siding or roofing. I can access them here, and I can attribute that to the ceiling. So, between all of those options, the percentage key and these additional materials, you can kind of get pretty precise with your model. Or you can just use it at this really high level of like, I want to know the difference between this insulation and that insulation. Like it also has value just at that sort of straightforward level, but you can make a pretty, complex whole building model in here too.
Yeah, I think that's the original question being like, can you use this for retrofits? Can you use this for for various applications. No, you're right in there. And as I say, I do a lot of retrofit work. I do new construction work, and I also do like larger institutional work. And like the same tool, I will find using different points of analysis depending on what question I'm trying to answer. And so, if you're like really trying to dial in and comparing two different types of insulation, like we just saw a good example of that. Ben, you mentioned the like compare and contrast two different assembly approaches. Like that's a super common retrofit like analysis scenario for us. Like which wall approach do we want to use in this case, or foundation approach? And then if you're looking at whole building results, like Chris is saying, you can get really detailed. I've done some institutional buildings with like a whole lot of information in there, and that would be like pretty decent for reporting. And I've also been super psyched to have such a flyweight tool in schematic design when we're trying to like set the trajectory of a design and kind of need to do a sensitivity analysis of like, well, what's the total carbon we're kind of looking at? So like, how much do we care about this insulation or that insulation? You kind of need to look at that. And then you also need to look at the whole, and having a tool that just takes like, a couple of hours. If you have all of your inputs and all of your material selections, like compiled, like actually filling out the tool, like an hour, maybe. I mean, really it's the information gathering that's the lengthy part. So yeah, to that point of like, you can kind of use it for, I don't want to be too like excited, but I almost use it for anything. I find myself using it in all types of buildings throughout the entire phase, as long as you're happy just looking at materials. I think that's maybe the thing to call out is if you're looking for full LCA, total life cycle analysis of the building, that's not what's going to be in this tool. So for those of you that are working with Tally or working in LCA, I use this as a companion to Tally. We use Tally in our design team. And it's a great companion depending on what information you're trying to get.
Can you guys elaborate a little bit about what parts of the EPDs or LCA this utilizes? Because there's some questions about whether transport to site is in there and full life cycle. So this tool is just in LCA speak A1 to A3, or sort of cradle to gate emissions. So not transport to site is not included here. Neither are installation emissions that happen on site, with the exception of any product, and I guess this is pretty much the spray applied foam products where a whole bunch of emissions necessarily happen during installation. Then we are counting those because they're literally like an off gassing that happens. But otherwise, it's sort of cradle to gate. And the couple reasons for that, one being that is the bulk of the emissions that will occur during the life cycle of these materials. It's starting to like pan out across a lot of LCAs that it looks like, from the high 60s to low 90% of all the emissions associated with the material happen in this phase. So this is like us kind of calling out this as like the big chunk that we could deal with. It's also the part that is the most verifiable in that, you're actually counting the emissions that happen kind of in the factory setting where it's pretty straightforward to be able to measure that. And there's sort of like a fairly large set of EPDs that only count A1 to A3. So it also means that we could have the biggest range of materials in here, because if we wanted to, add other life cycle elements, we'd have to drop a bunch of materials that don't have that incorporated. So, for those reasons, we've really focused on that. We thought a lot about transportation to site. As part of my master's work, I actually looked at the transportation to site numbers that were in the EPDs and in some of the LCA tools, and then looked at a few of those materials, for my location, and found that the actual transportation emissions were off by an order of magnitude that made me really think, like, is it helpful to give people a number that's such a weird generalization that it may be off by an order of magnitude or not? And, in the end, we sort of defaulted to, well, not. Like it's important, but we can't give you that information accurately. We could sort of like parrot the really broad generalizations that come in these databases, but it's not that helpful. They tend to say, well, let's identify a factory here and your site here, and it's X miles between the two, and it's probably going to go by truck, so the emissions are this. Whereas when I trace materials, it's like,
it doesn't go from the factory to my job site. It goes from my factory to some logistics hub, to some, retailers like main warehouse, to a sub warehouse, to my retailer, to my job site. And no sort of like, software calculation is going to have that accurately. So we kind of leave that to users to go, well, now that I've looked at this, I know this material is coming from far, should I weigh that into my considerations? But, we really are focused on that huge chunk that is that upfront material emissions.
One thing I can recommend is if you look at your like highest mass materials, there are some pretty like flyweight tools out there. None that I have in my head. I had to shut my computer down. I'm on my iPad, so I can't pull that up really quickly, but I can follow up with that, where you can get a general sense of the weight. Like if we're looking at like hot, importing some masonry or something along those lines, looking at the weight and looking at the mode of transportation, they're pretty quick inputs. I've ended up using that a fair amount for trying to dial in the transportation for the most mass intensive materials. Like there's a couple, this is where like, it really depends on what question you're trying to answer. How valuable is that? And I totally agreed. Having like non-useful or inaccurate assumptive data, I'm not really convinced actually gets us to a better place. Although at the same time, for trying to get the full carbon picture, like just acknowledging what the gaps are. And if you've got the wherewithal to fill in some of those blanks, MEP is another one. Like the more we look at that, the more we see like, one, it can be a big number, and two, it's a huge range. And so just need to be aware of what's being counted and what's not being counted when you're trying to actually, make a statement about what the results of the tool are.
So as long as we're not powering the job site by burning old tires, we're probably doing the lion's share of emissions in A1 to A3.
Yeah, and even if you're not, like if you look at LCA studies, transportation to site and site emissions typically range from like 5 to 10% of the whole life cycle emissions. So you have kind of like 60 to 90 upfront. You've got like 5 to 10 in like, transportation site. Then depending on how you want to count, like replacement and end of life, which is another thing we leave out because, I really feel like it's not, again, it's not that those considerations aren't important, but the numbers that we're giving people in typical LCA are not accurate and may not be helpful. You
have to make such broad assumptions and generalizations about what's going to happen over the lifespan of that building. You're really just guessing at that point.
Yeah, including that, the material, if you say, well, it needs replacing in 15 or 20 years, the assumption built into LCA studies is you will replace it with the exact same material and it will have the exact same carbon footprint as it does today. That's not going to happen. All of that could change. I could replace it with a different material. I could let it stay on my building for 20 years longer than the manufacturer suggested. Like there's so many, uncertainties I feel like in those numbers that, like, obviously in my own practice, I care a lot about how long things last, what happens to them when they're gone. But I feel like I can't represent that in a number to you in a tool. And I've kind of been using this analogy lately that what we're giving you is like the fuel mileage rating for a car. If you're going to go buy a car or truck, there's this big number you care about. It's fuel mileage. The other numbers are like, how many oil changes does it take? How many times are you going to change the brakes? Those aren't not important questions. They're a lot smaller than the fuel mileage question. They're real, they happen. There's differences between models and all that kind of stuff, but you wouldn't go looking for a number that's like, what is fuel mileage plus oil changes plus tire changes plus brakes plus when I get rid of the car, what happens to it? What is the number for that? It's like, well, I could say 56, but it's not really that helpful. So I feel like what we're giving people is this really big, really important number that we can influence. We can influence it today. And we think all of this other stuff is really important to think about, but we can't like give it the number that we can for these upfront emissions.
A question in the chat that I think will be good for the recording is how do we get access to this tool?
Oh, you go to buildersforclimateaction.org. There's a tab there for Beam, and you just kind of follow the instructions from there. And I'll just mention, we did decide to make it free, so there is no cost to access the tool, but you'll notice a fair bit of language as you go through the process of signing up where we're asking you to contribute. The tool came from a very small not-for-profit. We don't have a lot of funding. People keep asking about updates and new versions. Really, if people support us generously, we'll be able to do those things. And if they don't, we won't. So it is very much like a user-supported tool. So we
pony up and throw some money in the hat, folks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We didn't want to put up a paywall and make barriers to it, but we also, are hoping that people will, see, hey, this is valuable to my practice, this is valuable to my business, and, throw us a few bucks for that reason.
Excellent. Another question is, Beam is one of the only tools, or maybe the only tool that accounts for carbon storage with bio-based materials. Can you explain why yours includes this and others don't?
Sure. It includes it because that was one of the things that I was really, from my own practice when I started exploring this, interested in doing, because I use a lot of bio-based materials, and I could, as I started doing the research, I could see that the approaches to how that was valued varied widely. So even in the rules, the sort of international ISO standard for making an environmental product declaration, it kind of gives the maker of the EPD 3 options for how to account for biogenic carbon, all of which give you a completely different answer. So it's, there really isn't a standard. And so I wanted an answer that gave me a standard. So we kind of baked in our own methodology for doing that, where we, literally in the tool, we're figuring out, how much of the material is made out of what biomass, how much of the weight of that biomass is carbon, using a database called the Phyllis database that kind of has hundreds of samples of different materials. So we're kind of taking averages from that, and then, sort of applying that to the material. So, we know that when we see those carbon storage numbers, they're not the random things you might see in an EPD. They are all comparable. Why? Because we think it's super important. The Build Beyond Zero book that I was talking about at the start, we really do feel like the proper use of carbon storing materials, whether they're bio-based or, we're seeing more and more sort of mineralized type products starting to emerge. That's the way we fix the climate. We don't fix the climate by reducing your emissions. That just slows down the climate getting worse. At best, people tend to aim for zero, which means I'm no longer making the climate worse. But Bruce and I called the book Build Beyond Zero, because the idea is we could actually be using buildings to make the climate better. And that's these carbon storing materials. And that's why we thought it was so important to, have a really strong and defensible methodology for making sure that those values showed up. And one thing to note for people who, have used Beam and wondered about this or are going to get into it, we aren't currently valuing carbon stored in virgin timber products. As we were looking at carbon storing methodologies, we're really trying to align ourselves with climate science. And there is a lot of climate science that says if you're diverting waste materials that we're going to end up back in the atmosphere as greenhouse gases, there's a value to that. If you are taking sort of short cycle crops or growing things and putting that carbon away, there's a value to that. Forests are way more complicated than those more straightforward calculations. And at this point, the state of LCA and the state of our sort of understanding of whether or not taking wood out of forests results in better outcomes for the climate or not, there's nowhere near consensus on that. And so, in the spirit of not encouraging people to do things that we don't actually understand, we're not attributing any carbon storage to wood. However, wood shows up, like the emissions that come from harvesting wood are actually like comparatively really low. Like it's also not an attempt to divert people from the use of wood, but it's trying not to ascribe it properties for the climate that we don't really know that it has or doesn't have.
Just add quickly to that, we use great description. I'm like, ooh, hard to follow. I work in Tally, and Tally actually does have a mechanism for like applying biogenic carbon storage. So it's not the only tool that does that. I will say, and this is, I love Tally, I use it regularly, and this is no slight, but like that's not super useful in that it just kind of gives you two different outputs without any real understanding of like what's going on kind of behind that. And the thing I really love about what we've done with Beam is that you can see what the emissions are, what the storage value is, and what the net is on a per product basis. And that actually feels really important, especially if, like, as Chris was saying around wood, like that's a really big deal, right? It would be technically accurate to say there's X amount of carbon stored in this stick of lumber, and that carbon was in the atmosphere before it was a stick of lumber, and like that's all accurate. But we're using this as an action tool for climate action, right? And so yeah, it's like, oops, led to deforestation because the numbers look convincing around wood, like that's kind of going against the entire ethos of the tool. And so having that transparency around what are the emissions and what are the savings, I think wood fiberboard is a great example. It's like probably the best board insulation solution we have, and it is pretty high emission to produce that stuff. And the only thing that's sort of like balancing off those emissions is that it's using waste or certified wood products that are kind of legitimately offering a storage value, mostly, and not for all products, and probably not forever. So like, we need to be super wise, eyes wide open, that we're not like, oh, thank God we have wood fiberboard, cool, now we can just like keep plowing ahead. Like, it's actually not that simple, should not be that simple. And for coming by this honestly, looking at this from the atmosphere's perspective and not from like the boundaries of an LCA calculation and the numbers say this perspective, like I think that's some of the intention in there, and just really helps unpack the like real complexity behind looking at biogenic storage. As critical as it is, the accounting on that is non-trivial. It needs to be done from an ecosystem perspective, which we as specifiers or architects or builders, like it's a little hard to unpack that. And like Forrest said, forest ecosystems are complicated. Agricultural waste byproducts, not so complicated. Great, yeah, diverting paper from a waste stream, that's not complicated. You don't have to work too hard to give value to that accounting.
Oh yeah, or on a related note, this is a question from David. Can you say something about the time value of these issues in regards to climate change? Basically, generally beyond the tool. You guys have talked about this ad nauseum, but just what is the rush and why?
No, thanks for the cue, David. That's really great. So I think one of the things that current LCA practice really overlooks, and it's problematic, but in general, like the way we tend to think about these numbers is, it's like, especially when you look at sort of life cycle assessments where kind of like one number represents the climate impact of that material or that building at the end of its life, totally ignores like when those emissions happen. Like, it's much better for the climate to have, say, I'm just going to use like stupid made up numbers, but like, 100 kilograms of emissions today and 1,000 in 100 years than to have 1,000 today and the 100 in 100 years, because the way greenhouse gases work is when they go into the atmosphere, they stay there a long time, and your 100 kilograms of emissions today do like warm the climate by a measurable amount. They degrade slightly, but next year it's still keeping the climate warm to the tune of like 90 kilograms, and like that, it has an impact that goes, over time. And so the emissions that are most important to reduce if we want to get the climate under control are today's emissions. That's why we're like big on this cradle to gate thing. It's like, if your building is going to put a boom of emissions into the atmosphere this big, and you can make it this big, that's not it is a one-time number when you get the number out of BEAM, but the impact of that like bounces forward, decades in terms of its ramifications. And so, that the emissions, the biggest emissions value you can have is to reduce or eliminate emissions today, because every time we emit anything, it adds to warming, and it doesn't go away. It's not like a poof, oh, it warmed it and now it's gone. It's like poof, it's warming it, and it's going to keep warming it, for a very long time. And so really, somebody just posted a link to dynamic life cycle assessment report, but that's, dynamic life cycle assessment is starting to recognize that. It's like one end of life number is not what we're talking about. It's, if the emissions or the storage happens now, like that's when we draw graphs of it, it's like, it's the area of the graph, not the point, so if you're sort of tracing an emissions, it's like, okay, I harvest the material, emissions go, I drive it to a factory, I process it, I drive it to a building site, and then it stays in the building. If you kind of draw that as a line, the end number is the number that a life cycle assessment will give you, but it's the area, the height of the line times time that is the impact on the climate. And if you're storing that carbon, it's the same, but in reverse. So the difference between the impact on the climate of a carbon storing material and an emitting material, it's not just as like little number, it's like all of that area, above or below that line. And so, we want to be driving these changes right now, today, because that's when they have the most important impact.
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Chris and Jacob's partner Ace presented at NESI back in like 2016 or 17, and just explaining this concept literally changed the course of my career. I'm still not doing things as carbon storage as I'd like, but just like, I don't think there would be a BSMB if not for them. So this is sort of my version of their graph, which shows on a 100-year scale, operating carbon and embodied carbon are both important. But if you cut back to just the first 10 years, which is what we have to worry about, then it's really, it's embodied carbon matters.
Well presented. Oh, jump in, Chris. Yeah, sure.
Nope, go ahead.
I was gonna say, and the corollary on the storage side, I mean, there's a couple of really big pieces there. Like, one, that's carbon that has already been stored. Like, we're not talking about like buying like credits for hypothetical trees that'll someday be planted and then store carbon like over the next multiple generations if they're not a clear cut for some other forest practice when no one's looking. I mean, that the whole like shell game of offsets is like super real. And if you're not considering time impact around that, that's just like pushing those savings way too far into the future to stabilize the chemical balance of the atmosphere. So when you're actually working with biogenic materials, was already carbon dioxide is now already pulled out of the atmosphere into physical product. And we have like a vanishingly small amount of time to do that. So, in addition to the cumulative effect over time, it's also like how much time we have to be able to actively reduce to manage the chemical balance of the atmosphere. And that's all about when that carbon has been drawn down. I think the language storage is also really important here too, because someone mentioned in the chat, I'm sorry, the chat's hard for me on my iPad and I have to like do that. So I'm abandoning the chat, my apologies, but someone mentioned something like, we see a lot of emissions in C4 and a lot of LCA, you'll see that like all of that stored carbon by a lot of LCA convention needs to be assumed that it is re-aerosolized in the atmosphere at the end of life. One, that's not a given, but two, like, this is temporal. We're saying storage and not sequestration for a reason. And I would say, for those of us that are building with biogenic materials, like, yes, the time value of making sure that we're, amplifying our partner industries in regenerative agriculture and sustainable forestry is like, that's all part of the movement. There's like, we could talk about supply chains and co-industries and sort of social movements around this every bit as much as we're talking about like calculations of carbon widgets from materials. Like it's all part of the picture. But end of life scenarios, like how we manage that carbon that is embedded in these building materials at the end of life or during renovations or remodels, like that ends up being part of this conversation too. And the time factor, like we've been talking about in the context of climate impact, but then as we're looking at the life cycle of a building and how our buildings are managed over their operational life and then the decommissioning or repurposing of buildings, like we have an entire other conversation around that and what the time, like the forward-casting and future casting that impacts design and what designing for reuse and was designing for disassembly. And, all of those conversations come into this as well. I'm not trying to like blow the context up too big, but it is to show like when you're talking about storing carbon, like it's dynamic in lots of ways. And all of these things are phenomenal opportunities for us to intervene in turning buildings into actual legitimate carbon storing, tools, opportunities, possibilities.
Yeah, the real kick in the pants for me was I saw a presentation you gave, Jacob, at Nessie, and I don't remember, it feels like a bazillion years ago. It was probably 10 years ago, something like that, where you showed a breakdown of the embodied energy of a passive house building. And it essentially showed that there was going to be no carbon parity for like 150 years. And that's assuming that the building was left completely untouched and like perfectly maintained. And like we all know that's never going to be the case. And that was like, there went my golden bubble of, I'm building these groovy passive houses and saving the planet, to realize I'm like, oh my God, I should actually just build a code built house and we'd probably be better off, which is not the truth. But, it's incredible when you start digging into this and the illusions that we all have through greenwashing and just our, the continual evolution of this field that we're involved in, and learning like there's so much more to this puzzle than we even know we don't know.
Yeah, and I'm always really, I have kind of become like the carbon number person, because the tool, like putting these numbers to it. But yeah, I just want to sort of like build on what Jacob was saying, is that, you can just as easily kind of like do the blinker lens thing with embodied carbon as with anything else. And I think that is kind of what happened then in the energy efficiency world. It's like we're pursuing like a number, this really low, whatever it was, if it happened to be passive house or whatever the target you're hitting was, it was all about this number. And it's like everything else, whatever, like if we get that number, we've got it. And I want to really make sure that we don't do the same thing with these carbon numbers. Like they're, and we want to start putting some of these numbers together. It's like, I quite often see people trying to like play embodied carbon and energy efficiency off against each other. No. We need to do both. Like these buildings need to be zero carbon in their operations. Absolutely. Like the climate won't work if we don't do that. And they need to be zero carbon or better in their construction materials. And those aren't like, I'm not going to do that because I'm doing this, or vice versa. It's like, no, if we're going to meet targets of, the kind we need to meet to get the climate under control, every building has to be at least zero on both counts. And it's not like, well, I'll just back off on the energy efficiency a bit because I'm using lots of bio-based materials. It's like, no. It has to be both of these things. And, my own lens is like, and then like, are these things we're doing like healthy for the people in the building? And, like the lenses kind of multiply. And I think, this is a great tool for figuring out that piece of the pie. And then you have to like back up and look at all the other pieces and see, how does it weigh up in total?
I think Stiebrick says we have to manage water and air with equal intensity. In this case, we have to manage operational and embodied energy with equal intensity.
Yeah, while still addressing water and air.
Water and air.
There's no point in building a zero carbon building if it fails.
It's going to leak. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is usually the part of the conversation, or like when I'm giving consultations or trainings, like the part of the point when people like either start getting like kind of inspired and excited about the challenge, or like totally overwhelmed and like
they're gonna back out.
Like okay, which is totally legit. And I think like on the one hand, like I think it's a completely, for those of you in the audience are like, oh my God, now like I thought everything I was doing was good and now I have to do all these other things also and I can barely do the things I'm doing now and like I'm out. Like one, that kind of reflects the intensity of the problem that we have to address. Like there is some real serious reality of like the challenge is that big, kind of, yes. And also, like, if we're coming about this from the reductionist perspective that we've all been trained in, like our approach to science and our approach to like buildings, which is to like break into small components and figure out how we add them all together to get a good outcome. And we have to add all these other small like components together. Like that's so overwhelming. Like take like the zoom out, and Chris mentioned like you can zoom out and look in the context of these other things. Like I'm a systems thinker, so like this comes to me a bit more naturally. But for those that tend to break into small pieces, like what can help this be a little bit more an easier point to enter into or a little less like overwhelming is like that bigger perspective, like using low food chain materials to still get high performance outcomes and like caring about airtightness and good flashing details. Like in the bigger patterns, like we can do this. There's a lot, like this is not actually a technological problem. We've got the building science, we've got the material knowledge, we've got the data transparency. Like it's doable. Like we can take a little bit of like an intensity break and feel like, now I have to think about more things. Like, well, you do, but like if you think about them in a slightly different way, look for bigger, fuzzier patterns. Like bio-based materials are better than petrochemical materials. Go there first. Like some basic like entry points there can demystify and de-intensify some of the like rigor behind all of this. Like the data matters, the rigor actually counts, and that's part of the practice and doing it again and knowledge sharing. But like if you're feeling paralyzed and petrified by the overwhelming nature of the task, like, yeah, take a breath, like, you know, let your eyes kind of like fuzz a little bit, look for the larger patterns, like there's precedent.
Grab another beer.
Grab
you
another
know, cider.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whatever helps you, like, because it's easy to get lost in the overwhelm and it's real. And that is a part of this too. I just see so many folks that have like worked so hard to dial the energy in and dial it down to like the watt, not even kind of kilowatts anymore, right? Or like individual BTUs. And like, it's not that that's irrelevant, but that level of focus and trying to hold that for all of this criteria, I would argue is like kind of impossible unless you already have multiple decades worth of time behind you. And so I feel like I've been bringing more of that perspective into these conversations because like, it's one thing to have a tool. It's another thing to know like when and how to use the tool. It's another thing to like emotionally prepare yourself or be prepared to like change your analysis perspective or your like priorities, your hierarchy of like evaluation and making design decisions. And like, that's part of the work too, if you haven't already been thinking about embodied carbon. And it can be exciting and it can be an opportunity, it can be empowering if you don't get too lost in the overwhelm of the details. I just want to give that little plug from the like emotional component of getting into this work, because that can be the most paralyzing of all of them. Right.
Yeah. And I'm noticing there's an interesting comment from Todd in the chat. You know, when I say that there aren't trade-offs, I you know, the way you're sort of describing it, I think there are. I think the tool can be really informative in that, you know, if you're about to pursue, like Jacob was saying, that last watt by, you know, adding an extra R3 to the whole outside of the building or going for the triple pane windows, it's like, that's where this tool is really helpful. It's like, so what are the carbon implications on the material side of doing that? And is there like a meaningful sort of balance or trade-off with that? And, you know, the answer, there isn't an answer, but there are answers that you find out. But, you know, I think one of the things that the tool really does is sort of like show you that I mean, first of all, when we're talking about energy efficiency of buildings, we're kind of still barking down the wrong path. We should be talking about the emissions efficiency of buildings. Like I can have an energy pig of a house if it's completely running off my solar panels. It's not that big a deal for the climate. You know, it's a big deal for me and my costs and maybe whether I'm comfortable and how long the building lasts. Like there's, you know, there are implications other than the climate for energy efficiency. But when you're like grinding down to that last, you know, kilowatt, it's like maybe back up and go, hey, if I'm running this on electricity and the electricity is pretty clean and I'm about to cause like seriously, I mean, you could be causing 20 tons of extra emissions by throwing that last wrap of insulation and that last, you know, bunch of triple pane glazing and that last layer of insulation under the foundation, that's where the tool is really helpful. It's like the cost to the climate of that is this. The repercussions for the climate of that in performance of the building might be this. If those two things don't balance out, then that's one of the helpful things that that the tool can do. But I think also your question sort of made it seem like you can only achieve these kind of higher performance levels with high impact materials, but that's not true. I mean, we could all just start insulating buildings with cellulose, carbon storing, and like a decent R value, and there's you could meet any code, any requirement, any passive house standard with better carbon performing materials, and quite often with carbon storing materials. So it's not, that's when I was saying there's no trade-offs, it's like, that's what I mean. It's like it's not like you can have both. We can have a win-win. We can have a really high performing building with a really low or even negative carbon emissions associated with it, in the exact same way that we could have a really bad performing house with really high emissions materials. Like, all of those possibilities exist, and hopefully the tool helps steer people to the better sort of scenario, that kind of win-win where you're using better materials and still achieving really great energy efficiency.
Yes.
So I have
go ahead, Emily.
I have sort of a dumb, maybe it's not a dumb question or a related question, and I know it goes back to everybody fund this project. So everybody fund this project. So like when I fill out the calculator or whatever, do you get a copy of that spreadsheet? And if you do, and you can collect all of that data, right, there's just like a ton of data or whatever, does that help to lead people to kind of back to what Jacob was saying, if it's like too much of a bigger picture or whatever? Some of us who are real nerds who are like, I'm going to do this for everyone because this is cool and I want to know, and whatever, you've collected data maybe that's regional in your area. For some of the people who don't want to go all the way through the tool, if you're like, we've done it like these 6 ways, and hey, like, check this out or whatever. So does any of that data come back to you, or could it come back to you for those of us who will collect it for once we fund additional research for that to end goal change how our products and materials are made in the United States and Canada and everywhere else, but like whole lot of other big things, but maybe to make it easier for people for things that are available in their area, or people who are really into it to kind of say, here's some suggestions or whatever.
Yeah, that is a great question, and the answer is sort of. So when you sign up for Beam, you can check a little box that says, yes, I will allow my anonymized data to be collected for research purposes. So if you tick that box, every time you actually finish a project, so as you're saving projects, it kind of says like, is this complete or not? When you finally hit this is complete, and if you've hit the like, yes, I'll share my anonymized data, then we do get that. So we are building up a repository of completed projects that we can sort of use. But I think and that I think will be really helpful. Also, people can go to the Builders for Climate Action website and see some of the studies we've done where we just finished looking at over 500 houses in Toronto, and we just finished doing a study for Vancouver, and we've done one for Nelson, BC, and really it's kind of shocking, but the average emissions from all of those buildings, like, and from those studies, like from those distinct regions, all land within a very tight little circle. Like it's, and so it really feels like the mainstream, house building world is kind of building in a fairly similar way, and the results kind of all land within a pretty predictable circle. And so one of the ways you can use Beam is, you don't have to run a stupid Beam model every time you build a house. Like, figure out a good foundation assembly, a good wall assembly, and like, you're going to get the same answer next time. Like, it doesn't, and the results are like, between materials are always proportional. Like if your house this time has 1,000 square feet of wall, and the difference between insulation A and B was 50%, it's still 50% if next time you have 2,000 square feet of wall. Like, you can internalize what you learn from Beam pretty quickly. To be honest, like, I don't really use the tool anymore because I know these answers well enough that I know the things I want to build with, because I know what my answer is more or less going to be. And if I need to run a model to prove that, that's great. But it doesn't take, I think, very long to go, oh, like, I get how this works, in the same way that people pursuing energy efficiency, like, you get that air tightness matters. Like, so you start making your buildings airtight. If you get what are the high emissions materials, what are the low ones, and what are the storing ones, they're always that. It doesn't change. So I think, hopefully the tool just gives people that, after you use it for a while, a pretty great sense of like, yeah, okay, I know how to do embodied carbon now, because, unless some radical new material pops onto the market, I've seen all the numbers and I know where they lie, and they're going to keep lying there until, something comes along and changes them.
Can you explain MCE and MCI for everybody?
Sure, yeah. So MCE is our sort of shorthand for material carbon emissions, which is kind of like the total from a building. So it's, you add up all the materials for the whole building and you get this number, which is helpful, but it's not helpful when we're starting to try to look at different buildings, right? Because if I build a 10,000 square foot house, there's a good chance its MCE is bigger than the 1,000 square foot house just by amount of material. So MCI is material carbon intensity. And so that's the total, the MCE divided by square meters or square feet of floor area. And so then I can sort of go, oh, like, look at that. Like, by intensity, this little house was actually worse than the big house, or vice versa. But it sort of gives us a way to, when we're doing these studies, to kind of, give people a metric that you can compare between buildings.
Yeah, close analog and a good companion metric would be EUI for those of you in the operational nerd world, right? I also think about like the difference between a CFM versus your ACH 50 or CFM 50 per square foot. Like, they both hold relevance, but one actually scales up to the building.
So two related.
For the next question. Oh, jump in there, Mike. Yeah.
Oh yeah, just two related questions. One from Matthew Alcorn. Based on your research, what are the best building assemblies? I think he's trying to get away from actually having to do his own inputs, and but I want to know as well. And then from Tom DeVore says 250 kilogram carbon dioxide equivalent emissions per meter square is roughly the average for most wood framed homes. 75 per meter squared is considered really good. Can you speak to what it takes to get to and beyond zero? So what are some good assemblies you might recommend? I mean, I know we're both on the sort of, pretty good, like a little different from mainstream versus like, what should we really be doing? And then what sort of answers should we be looking for from this tool?
If you don't mind, I might answer those in reverse order. So Tom's numbers of 250 kilograms of CO2 per square meter, that's a little higher than the average we found in the studies that we've done. Both Toronto and Vancouver were actually 190. So, but something like that, you're right. And 75 would be good. Only one house of all the ones that we've studied for the cities has come in at that. But we did find one that did. And interestingly, built by a builder who was not paying attention to embodied carbon. It was just the way that they had decided to build. This was their business as usual, got them to 72. So, that in itself is kind of interesting. And then, getting to zero and beyond zero, really, it's like, there's kind of two strategies. One is you look at the materials that are causing your big emissions, and they are concrete, brick, and foam-based insulations. Like, across our studies, when we amalgamated all the data for all the houses, concrete was basically a third of all the emissions across 800 odd houses that we looked at. Insulation sort of was around 20%, and cladding was around 15 to 20%. There's some difference because some places use a lot more brick than others, but like those three areas are typically like 70% of the total emissions for a house. So how do you get to zero? You look at those big areas and you go, how do I minimize those? So you have to like minimize your emissions and then maximize your either super low or net carbon storing materials. They are, you know, I sort of hesitate to suggest assemblies because it's like, where do you live? You know, what are you trying to do? What's accessible to you? What is your price range? Who's going to build it?
It depends.
It depends. There's a big it depends, but you know, bio-based materials and sometimes they're kind of, oh, like those must be weird exotic things, but I mean, I'm not being paid by the cellulose insulation industry, but there's a bone simple, you know, thing to do, you know, put cellulose in. It's been on the market for a long time. We know it works. There's people who can do it. It's affordable and it stores carbon. So some sort of cellulose-based insulation is a pretty good staple. You know, in the Toronto study, we had one developer, and again, like a big, you know, multi-hundreds of houses a year developer whose baseline models were all coming in at 115 kilograms per square meter when Toronto's average was 190. The difference, he put cellulose in the walls in the attic. That's it. Everything else was the same between all of those houses. But in that move, like when I showed that to the folks at the city of Toronto, it's like, so Toronto has a target of reducing emissions in the city by 40% by 2030. Here's a builder whose business as usual case is 40% less than today's average. Like that's all it's going to take for us to get from here to there to meet your climate goals by 2030 is every tract developer moves to cellulose. It was literally that straightforward in that case. So, you know, cellulose-based assemblies are pretty good, you know, and just, yeah, it's kind of a balance of, you know, avoid or use the least of the high emitting materials and, you know, adopt and use the carbon storing ones. And that's, you know, that's going to be the strategy, but it's going to be, you know, the practicalities and the you know, the actual assemblies are going to be really different based on all the factors that make buildings interesting, you know, climate and region and, you know, the owner's tastes and all, you know, vernaculars and all of that kind of stuff.
I'd offer just a couple of other things in terms of actually getting to zero. I mean, I'm going to go so far as to say straw or hemp. I mean, the ag residues are like massive storing agents, and it's no longer about like installing individual bales in place and putting a plaster in place. Like there are prefabricated straw panel systems that can be, you know, brought into a host of different projects that will actually shorten your construction timelines, reduce, you know, all the general requirement costs that like add up with every single day that the job site is running. If you're running in the cold season, it'll actually reduce your A5 emissions because you're not having to keep that building heated during the cold season as long. If you're in a cold climate, like there's some reciprocal benefits for shortening, you know, the construction timeframes that reduce emissions. And, you know, so like, yep, there's some like really amazing opportunities there of banking ag residue materials into buildings. And I'm a straw champion, but I mean, it could be hemp, it could be, you know, rice hull, it could be any of these materials. Like granted, those aren't quite as easy and immediate to swap over from cellulose, but if we're really talking about getting to zero, I'm like, yeah, we're gonna have to go there ultimately as an industry, and 40% won't be enough. And so like actually getting to zero is going to involve the adoption of some of those more like deep storage, short cycle crop materials. And then to zoom like way out, you know, someone mentioned like, yeah, be careful about EUI, you know, the same reason that ACH 50 isn't necessarily as accurate because it scales differently with the surface to volume ratio of a building. Like I would actually love to start seeing like per occupant ratios and bringing like building intensity per like intensity of like people getting service out of the building into the real equation, having resource equity enter into the conversation around this. So if we're really talking about this honestly, we have to bring the social components into how we engineer structure and shelter into human society if we're like really trying to get to zero and coming by that honestly. And so, you know, looking at reducing massing, looking at simplifying building enclosure, a lot of these similar things that we look for like the cheap ways to get energy efficiency, like also dovetail with material reductions, which also reduces costs. So everyone always thinks that like, oh, it's going to cost more to be green. Like, not if you're using less stuff. Like there are actually some stacked benefits for more like comprehensive, holistic perspectives on how we provide built environment for ourselves. And so some of that gets super micro, some of it's actually like a little bit more macro. And yeah, if you're working on a building by building basis, you may not have like a ton of agency there, but you do in terms of supporting industries that are working with agriculture residues. There is some like, investment capital that goes from the billions of dollars that our industry spends on materials. Like, let's funnel that towards some of these innovative and developing materials that are our carbon heroes. And also just encourage our clients to build smaller, because that's in their best interest, especially in this like completely nutso crazy market that we're in right now. So I'm going to encourage, in terms of like getting to zero, is going to kind of be like, yes, and every tool in the book kind of approach, if we're really coming by that, like as honestly as I think we're all trying to in addressing like the big problem. And so, yeah, there'll be some holistic, bigger picture thinking that will be required to figure out what interventions hit a number of those benefits. And it's not just some added cost or added effort or extra thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, there's a lot of really exciting things happening now to address those materials that are the high emitters. Like there is so much fascinating work going on in the sort of cement and concrete world, from, Biomason, who's now, you can actually buy their bricks and tiles. They're grown brick from microbes. So they're actually taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and fixing it while making a masonry material. You've got Blue Planet that's pulling CO2 out of smokestacks and turning it into aggregate that can go into concrete. You've got Living Materials Lab doing algae-based cement materials. Like, there's stuff going on with mycelium composites that's really interesting. So one of the things that, because I was not a production builder when I was building, but most of my work now is with production builders. And it's, if you think about it, I'm sort of reflecting on your don't panic, Jacob, about, if you think about, if you want to match your building practice to the kind of like overall climate goals that we all have, look at BEAM and go, this year I only have got to knock like 5% off my building. And if I can then knock 5% off next year and next year and next year and next year, in the 8 years we have to 2030, I'm at my 40% by 2030. Be more ambitious and knock 8% off a year, and you'll be beyond that. And so, like, we don't have to make this jump in one building in 1 year. Like, if you can sort of use a tool like BEAM and go, I should really talk to my concrete supplier and see if I can get this 50% SCM mix, because that'll be my 10%. That one move is my 10%. I'll do that this year. I'll see how that works. I'll see what the costs are like. I'll see does it impact anything? And if that's working great, then next year I'll start putting cellulose in the attic. There'll be another 10% right there. And now you're at 20. The year after that, try cellulose in the walls, or maybe compressed straw is coming along, or maybe you try a straw panel. But like there's a rush. Like, we do have a short amount of time, but you don't have to get to the future today. You can really like plot this out. Like, what targets do you want to hit? If you think your state or your country or your city's ambitions aren't high enough, then set your own. But you'll see, like, that's the interesting thing of using the tool. Like, we showed builders, like, here's 75% that you can cut with 5 changes. They don't cost you anything. And everybody's like, whoa, I can actually do that, and those things are real. And then the last part, from the 50% reduction or the 70% reduction down to 0, there's a bunch more work in that. That is where we have to start thinking about designs. Maybe we can't put basements under houses anymore and hit 0, or maybe there will be carbon storing concrete by then and we should make bigger basements. But if you do what you can do today to really, like, attack that in the ways that make sense to you and are approachable to you, and now you can measure them, do that. And like, often that's what happens, right? Like, if you'd said to somebody 20 years ago, every house needs to be passive house, it'd be like, right. But that, not that every house is passive house, but like, that's not a crazy thing to think anymore, that that we could actually get there. And it's because it happens in steps. And I think, I would encourage you to think about this embodied carbon thing in that same way too. Like, you don't have to get to zero today. If you can, great. Like, I'm not gonna, tell you not to, but you don't have to. Like, you can use the tool to find those pieces that work for you and that are approachable.
The other thing I want to slip in there,
That's so great. I wanted to make just that comment a little earlier, like, eat the elephant in small bites. And that, like, find the division that, like, you can respond to. The one thing we haven't talked about at all, it's all been like structure and insulation, which makes a ton of sense because those are like big, obvious things. But good Lord, there is so much carbon emission and so much storage potential in finishes. And, I've worked with a bunch of architectural firms that, that's kind of the agency they have for, that's one of the larger dials they have to really control, especially earlier on. And you look at like high emission versus low emission carpeting, like, good Lord, the difference between like one gypsum wallboard spec and another can be like 20% just in product selection. So now there's some procurement issues and there's some like details to follow through there, but like, dude, that's amazing. And you think about depending on your building type, there can be like many more hundreds of square foot of surface area and internal partitions than you have in your externals. And so you look at all the okay, I'm gonna give one example here that I get like super pumped about. I was working on an institutional building where you looked at a spec change on their acoustic bat, like the R12, like 2x4 acoustic bat insulation for their interior partitions. And we made a spec change from was a fiberglass to a standard fiberglass acoustic bat to like a cellulose bat product. And it was the difference between emitting 2 tons of emissions or storing 4 tons of emissions. And it was like negligible in the overall cost of the project. And I'm just like, what an amazing sleeper hit of a carbon storage story of interior acoustic bats. Yeah, it's just more stuff to store more carbon, and it may not be as sexy as mass timber, but it's super relevant, and there's a ton of it in every building, and that's zero difference in labor, and the cost is incremental in change. And at this point, who knows, it may even be cheaper. Costs change by the week, it seems.
Excellent. Well, we are getting towards the end here, just a few more minutes. Kurt had asked about what conferences builders should attend, but I'll expand that for everybody whose mind is blown and who want to use your tool, but for whom this is a big jump. How do you recommend people get educated? Conferences, books, Chris's new book, Build Beyond Zero, Jacob's book, Essential Building Science is a good one. What else? How do you guys recommend people get up to speed on what they need to know? So do you want to start, Jacob?
Sure. Yeah. There's a bunch. For those of, okay, let's see. I'm just going to prattle off a few just right at the top of my brain. The Carbon Leadership Forum, I would say, is maybe one of the better overall networks and resource banks of information. They may scale a little bit larger in some cases in terms of company size and building size. But it really is a pretty amazing, not just basis of resource and research in their website, but I'm involved with the Boston hub, and they have a bunch of regional hubs and regional networks that I think are there's kind of a pretty critical component to all of this. Again, I'm sort of wearing my heart on my sleeve. I feel the social and emotional components of this are every bit as relevant and important when you're trying to shift practice and shift mindset and intention as the actual tools and information and data. Because there's a lot of that out there. CLF is a good one. Levy out of the UK has a bunch of really good infographics and information. But I've found it to be really useful to find my people and get some emotional support, or just trading ideas and tips, or workflow practices, or approaches, those types of things, which are a little harder to find in a white paper or to just grab at a conference. So CLF is probably the most well organized and well distributed group of networking hubs. If you jump on their website, they'll say who's in your region. So I'll give that a plug. In terms of conferences, I'm really Northeast sort of based and biased, so I'll totally own that. But Efficiency Vermont's building Better Buildings by Design is a great conference. NESI as an organization, I'm like super grateful to the work that they've done in embracing this as a value and a priority. And again, another more regional based, but like a really strong network for sort of peer support and peer value in trying to do this work, as well as some good information and resources that are sort of within the archives of that organization. I think the Pacific Northwest Eco Guild, geez, I'm butchering that name, but throw that in the chat for those of you that are out in that corner of the world. I know there's some really good folks that have been focusing on that in that part of the world. I think NAFN, the North American Passive House Network, has really embraced embodied carbon as a core part of the value of the work that they're doing. FIAS, I believe, is getting on board with that as well, although I'm sort of less familiar there. So yeah, those are some of like the quick bits and bytes and resources that come to the front of my brain. Chris, I'm sure you have a million others.
Yeah, I mean, I will just sort of make a plug for our Builders for Climate Action website. Like we exist because we want to support this sector, and all of our studies and reports and videos and stuff are all there. So I think please lean on that resource.
And the Pretty Good House book whenever it finally hits people's hands.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, who knows when.
You may get it sometime, some year.
Excellent.
Thank you both for sharing so much of your time with us tonight. This is awesome. And I hope that everybody who stayed on will continue to share what you're doing to get it to a wider audience. I know we'll be doing it at all the building conferences and all of the architectural conferences that we're going to across the board to get people interested and to support you for continued research when all of us nerds need more information because we don't have enough data.
Data. Yes. Yeah. Thank you guys very much for everything.
Yeah. And thank you guys and everybody who showed up. It's so nice to kind of feel like there's a home team here that is interested. The nerds and the builders. It's great. I really love being here.
The hands, light work.
Yeah.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Have a great night.